reality, or a projection of it, has created its negative imprint, infusing into itself the Shadowfell, which, upon the function of the wizards of Lucifer who contracted the soldiers of light in order to betray Garland, a con amongst all scams, the deceiving of those who are readily available to swords and extortions and distortions, have become upon it its reflection in the dread realm, which then materializes the function of their observation of the apocalyptic future, which was nothing more than their gazing into the Shadowfell, which, having perceived itself upon the conversion by the defeating of the man and the creating of the devil, and to this ends the Antichrist, having resurrected himself, infused into their brains the capacity for their permanent wars against it, and in the function of them using the scrying materials, have created the very events that they sought in order to undermine. At which point, Garland, being cast into the Shadowfell, becomes infused into it. He becomes the Gloom Stalker. He becomes the Shadow Sorcerer. He infuses the function into the entirety of his essence as he traverses the form and materializes his own dreaded domain as the mechanism of its various contemptuosities, as they facilitate armies upon armies and dreads and forms of all kinds of malicious distortions, having engaged in the full ingestion of this function, cast by those tricked by Baalzebul, who, having determined to himself to make these soldiers of light to become his new meal, the lawful good converted to extraordinary evil by virtue of their own lack of insight. This then materializes the negative reflection, and the potency of reality has created the potency of the darkness, and thus the activity of the brightest light comes in the darkest of darks. And to this end, this is the darkest of nights, perpetually infusing itself into the entirety of one's consciousness, has purged all senses of themselves until the function of those compounding betrayals becomes reality incarnate, and each subversion and backstab, having materialized its own form of subversion in the unlimited horrors that is all time, however, does provide many advantages, as even when barely bleeding or greatly bleeding, it becomes one and the same, even when badly injured, because you will barely bleed when greatly injured. The function of the injury becomes impossible for any enemy, as it is once said in the Predator's montage, if it bleeds, it dies. But what if it doesn't bleed? When casting a shadow derived by the most eminent and brilliant of lights, you generate your control over the function of the shadow, as the evil in the shadow is the negative reflection inverted onto itself, and without your eye to correct the reversion, is permanently preserved as its reverse form, and thus creates the entry levels of rituals in order to control it, in order for it to be pierced through, in order to rescue it. But if Griffith is going to rescue Garland, He is going to have to become Sempto. He must make his ultimate sacrifice. As he pierces the veil in order to impregnate it, in order to mature the function of its most twisted forms, ever elusive and entirely unpredictable as the function of water sifting through one's hand. Can they pass the rituals? Can they accomplish their missions? Only time shall tell, but how quickly and how dangerous is entirely an unpredictable illusion, as the function of ambush derived by shadow creates the function of its danger in its ever-observant alertness materializes the function of every creeping horror which lies just beyond the bend. Having created himself to become a demi-lich, the garland materializes the function of these compounding exchanges as the hags actively barter the function of the larva, which, viewing him with malicious contempt, give him the lower grades, which, by all terms and services, is just fine for his purpose, at which point the function, having turned into his conquest to fight the worm who walks, will, if escapes, have to conquer and become the worm who walks, and in this exchange materialize the hell larva into that as a permanent state of their identity, becoming the patron of them as they separate and become copies, infusing their loyalties and others into the warlock's function as the Shadowfell becomes tapped out in its use, stressing the extraordinary powers infused into him from the negative energy of the Shadowfell powers all of his support of his warlocks, who must sustain themselves through their arcane focus. Ritual, understanding this, actively infuses his support forces in their various alignments and classes in order to properly use this, draining the dread form of the soulless shadow, dividing, the dampering, the retarding, the gagging, restraining him from his former self, as it is always to be understood that memory was the power, and self-realization requires to realize oneself. This, however, is no small task, as the function of the primary source material, funneling that reflection, this inversion, this perverse prison, sustaining himself in this ever-expanding dreaded domain of horrors, consistently materializing the infusement or ingestion, as nature hates a vacuum, so the Shadowfell views the puncture as an active stream in order to shoot forward, as the highly pressurized place has a leak in it, which is spreading out, and this will not release him even if a form has escaped, creating a resource that must be divided and spent, or it will reclaim them. Everything must materialize from extraordinary combinations of the most impractical solutions, infusing all of these powers. Everyone must accept their part, and all of them were deceived, because there was one ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them.